social matters. Because deep below that, he was doing shakubuku. And therefore, in arranging the program for this course, we titled each session Buddhism and, okay? Because Sensei didn't necessarily preach Buddhism all the time he was talking until he reached the end of the dialogue, and he then really went in full blast. We shall cover those sections in a couple of months' time or so. So this particular section we call Buddhism and War and Peace, okay? So first of all, in the context of all that's said in this particular section 7 of the book, which I hope you've had time to read, and if not, you certainly should, first perhaps we ought to consider the whole matter of war from the point of view of karma. So you're all fully aware, I think, that karma applies collectively as well as individually. And from that point of view, as followers of Nichiren Daishonin, we look upon war absolutely, quite rightly, as the ultimate slander against the dignity of life in a collective sense. Murder or destroying someone else's life is the ultimate slander in terms of the individual. War is mass murder in a sense. And of course, because of the existence of a law of cause and effect, wars lead to more wars, and more wars, and more wars, and more wars, and more wars, so that we look back over the history of Europe and we see war, and quite desperate, ferocious wars over the last 1,000 years and more. And worse still, of course, as the cause and effect become deeper and worse, so the wars become worse and worse. So we've seen through that history wars which were originally little more than tribal or racial wars, which developed eventually into national wars. We've seen what were originally sort of amateur soldiers that were just called up by their feudal lords when a battle was brewing, to huge professional armies surrounded by enormous conscripted armies, navies, and air forces, such as were developed in World War I and carried over into World War II. So the escalation of war is unbelievably horrible, isn't it, in that sense? This is all cause and effect. So we have a karma in Europe of more than 1,000 years of almost continuous war in one part of Europe or another. And for a lot of that time, of course, this country was deeply involved as well. I think there can be no doubt, as with all other things, that in the end, when you consider the whole slander, the horrible slander of war, it comes down to, in the end, incorrect or inadequate religious teachings. So inadequate that in the case of all those European wars, there have been priests on both sides exhorting their people to fight. This is an extraordinary phenomenon, isn't it? And in a sense, it's crazy. So even in recent times, the same thing. German people being encouraged to fight by their vicars and clergymen and all the rest of it, probably under great fear from persecution otherwise from the Nazi regime. And equally, Western allies also being exhorted in the same way. So what else can this be? I wouldn't stand up and shout this at a public lecture, but what else can this be than incorrect or weak or partial religious teachings? Can't be anything else, can it? There is the most perfect example of it, perhaps. So the interesting thing, too, I think, in reading this section of the book is, again, Toynbee's amazing understanding of cause and effect, where he also sees, in a historical sense, looking back over the centuries, how one war has laid the causes for the next war in an endless chain. And of course, the greatest work of Nichiren Daishonin in this matter of war, violence, and so on, is the Risho Ankokuron. The Risho Ankokuron says in one part of it, the Ninno Sutra states, if a man destroys the teachings of the Buddha, when he dies, he will fall into one of the three realms of hell, hunger, or animality. Even if he should be reborn as a human being, he will be destined to become a slave in the army. Retribution will follow as an echo follows a sound, or a shadow follows a form. A person writing at night may put out the lamp, but the words he has written will still remain. Marvelous words, aren't they? So indelibly ingrained in all of us in Europe, very fact that we are in Europe is the karma of war. Even though we may come from West Indian islands from an ancestral point of view, or from India or Pakistan or wherever, still somehow in an extraordinary way, every one of us who lives today has that karma of war ingrained in our lives. And of course, in many other parts of the world too, the same would apply. So slander, the continuing slander of life in terms of war, is the inherent cause which constantly, or rather I should say the external cause, arising from the inherent cause of the three poisons of hell, hunger, and anger. So the authors then go on to consider the external cause in quite a lot of detail. And I found it extremely interesting. Right at the beginning, I think it was Sensei quoted the German philosopher called Clausewitz. He was a military philosopher. And Clausewitz said, just before World War I, that war was a form of armed diplomacy, if you please. When discussion failed, inevitably, human beings went to war to settle a matter one way or another. I'm really now looking at this, nearly as we are entering the 21st century. One would have thought that might have been said by someone 1,000 years ago, to have such a philosophy and to proudly preach it. But in fact, it was only just before World War I. So Toynbee rightly says it might be nearer the truth to say that war is the nemesis of the failure of diplomacy, which is much more near the point, I think. Even Winston Churchill once said jaw is better than war. It's a famous comment of his. So the great question is, why should diplomacy break down? Isn't it? Because it's always when diplomacy breaks down that war occurs. And both Toynbee and Ikeda absolutely agree that it's all to do with economics. It's economic pressures, in other words, that bring about war. So to open that up a little bit more and examine it, in the earliest times, war was usually waged by tribes and so on in order to occupy additional territory, perhaps to capture a few new wives because they felt they were too inward-looking or whatever it was in their own tribe. And also, of course, war could be waged in order to defend your own territory and prevent your own women being snatched by someone else. There were quite sort of simple reasons in a way, but in the end, even there, the reasons were economics. They wanted land to grab in order to provide more places for them to grow crops, or perhaps the place had some indigenous crop that was important to them. Anyway, basically simple reasons, but nevertheless economic ones, even in terms of keeping the tribe going by having every opportunity to create strong, good, healthy children. So as these wars developed, of course, that original fundamental simple reason became more and more expanded. So we see in the recent hundreds of years, wars, especially from the time that sea power enabled people to cross oceans without too much difficulty and make use of the economic resources, countries overseas. War expanded beyond the confines of a particular land area all over the world. People were greedy for more raw materials. They were greedy for more markets for their production, particularly after the Industrial Revolution and the mechanization of production. This became a sort of driving force. Again, one sees in it, of course, the poisons of greed, hunger, and plain stupidity and ignorance. Or equally, they wanted to defend their sources of raw materials. So if you go back and take a few examples, for instance, the Vikings and also the Norman invasion of William the Conqueror, this was due to, all in the end, the reasons were economic. They wanted the rich, open pasture lands, this country, in order to have more wool and make better products and clothe their people and give them an outlet for their desire to trade. Also, in the Middle Ages, war was often used as a way for a king, certainly in this country, and to a very great degree mirrored in France, to raise money. If the king ran short of money, the best thing he could possibly do to get more was to tax the people more heavily, because there was a threat of war with France, or there was a threat of war from France. Either could be used as a tactic to get money in order to, not necessarily just for their own pleasures, but in order to run the country in those rather primitive times. Then later, of course, we see the beginning of the colonial wars and colonization. These were purely economic in their driving force. The East India Company, for example, conquered India in the end. This was a trading company, but it was a trading company which expanded very greatly and eventually had its own army. So the origins of the Indian army was the East India Trading Company. And through those means, they conquered vast areas of territory. They wanted the raw materials from it, and they wanted the market for the cotton that was being made for the first time by machines in this country. Of course, in the end, those colonial territories were brought together under an empire system and began to be governed properly. But the opening stages of that act were purely traders and their desire for profit and money. Napoleon wanted to dominate Europe, not just for his own self-satisfaction, though that had a good deal to do with it, I think, but so that he could stabilize and enrich the economy of France. There was much poverty in those days in Europe. He wanted to see France rich and stable. This is why, in the end, he really wanted to conquer the whole of Europe. And Hitler was the same. in the end, it was economic pressures that brought about the circumstances for Hitler to gain power, because the German economy had been destroyed in World War I. So he had a perfect field in which to incite the feelings of the people and create the regime of a special, based on the idea of a special Aryan race and all the rest of it. But actually, it was economic reasons that enabled him to do such a thing. And of course, it's true, isn't it, that where the three poisons are at work, very often evil people will gain power, because they actually, in one person, say, in the case of a dictator, represent the three poisons which are afflicting all the people. Why do the three poisons afflict people? Because they have no means of battling with it. So you have to have an incredibly powerful religious practice and philosophy to do battle with those three poisons, which are innate in life. They can rise up in any of us, any time, unless we have the positive power to overcome them and keep them under control. Japan also started its colonial empire building because Japan was a country with very limited raw materials. Most of Japan, as you know, is mountain. Only a third of Japan is arable land, or land which is livable on by large numbers of people. So it was the economic pressures of a growing population which made them look outwards beyond Japan and begin their own colonial wars. And of course, interestingly enough, too, even in more recent times, for example, Afghanistan also has an economic background to the war which broke out there and which Russia began. Russia, for hundreds of years, had wanted a trade route and a port on the Indian Ocean. All the problems which lasted for the 250 years or so of the British Empire in India was because of the Russian threat on the northern border. There was always that worry that the Russians wanted to break through so that they could have that port and trade easily in the southern seas. Otherwise, during the winter, the Russian ports were all icebound, and this had a severe effect on their economy and their expanding population. So again, one sees that pressure of economy. So what the two authors summed up in their discussion on this point was that in recent times, to a growing degree, war actually stabilizes huge, complex economies. It actually stabilizes it because it uses up surpluses. These huge economies are created. The population also expands as the standard of living grows, and the number of mouths to feed and the number of people to clothe, the demands of the people for more in this material world are never ending. And of course, the businesses that are created have got to have something, somewhere to sell their goods. So it is the tendency, particularly in modern times, of businesses and factories to overproduce. Surpluses grow. We see it now in the economic community with all the huge mountains of butter and milk and wine and all the rest of it. Overproduction, which is permitted because it gives employment to the people. This struggle to find some sort of balance in an economy which is actually out of balance because people don't understand the law of cause and effect, and they don't understand the way one thing can lead to another in that way. And you'll see this more and more in this talk today. So war can stabilize economies and provide a market for surpluses. That's the point. The actual war effort unites or unifies the production system of a country and gives it an outlet. It's sort of sinister, isn't it? That in the end, it's those sort of pressures which are creating war. But of course, please remember, we're talking about the external cause. Still deep down, there's the inherent cause, which are those three poisons. So, of course, as that, through the war effort, the economic and technological development is enhanced or grows or is encouraged to grow, you in turn are actually creating the circumstances for another war. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So when you think the two world wars happened within 21 years of each other, I'm always saying this because it seems to be the utter, imbecility of human beings. When you think only 21 years between the two, what was it that created such a situation? So in the case of those who lost that war, their economies were destroyed and they had to recreate it in as rapid a way as they could. What better means to do so than to have the whole nation united with the idea of going to war again? This is the cause and effect, the endless chain. Everything is in a state of imbalance, in other words. And of course, we see this now to a very marked degree in the situation of Russia and America, the two superpowers. The two superpowers are wading their way through perfectly horrible economic situations, as I'm sure you realize through reading the papers. They're in great difficulties. So once again, there is this imbalance. And of course, it could lead to war as the only outlet. We already see it happening in terms of minor wars, which the superpowers are dabbling in one way or another. The Russians in Afghanistan, with perhaps that ultimate reason originally in their intention, because it's always has been a desire in Russia to have that port and that trading route in the southern seas. And equally, America in a fearful economic situation now. So things, in a way, fortunately, are different. I think for two reasons. The external reason is that someone invented the nuclear bomb. And ghastly as that is, or perhaps I should say, which is so ghastly that superpowers would hesitate to go to war. They try to exert their influence and dominate through minor wars. And the other reason, of course, is that there is something called SGI, which is still in its infancy, really, in terms of the population of the world. But nevertheless, there is that something called Daimoku being chanted, which has such a profound influence and which is difficult for us to see. So these circumstances, I'm sure, will actually overcome war in the end. And it's interesting that both Toynbee, with all his understanding of history and of karma and of cause and effect, says the same thing in this section and agrees with sensei. So we have to, in other words, set about changing that karma of war. The term Risho Ankoku, perhaps you may remember, Risho means establishing the ultimate truth. And Ankoku means securing peace in the land. Risho Ankoku. So the situation now is perfect for Kosen Rufu. In all the writings of Nichiren Buddhism, he emphasizes the time. There is a time. We can hasten the time, but there has to be a time when all the circumstances are right for this philosophy and practice to spread and for Kosen Rufu to be achieved. We needn't doubt that that time is now, because the first time mankind is faced with the fact that he can actually, in destroying someone else, inevitably destroy himself as well. So it is truly the time now for the great cause of Kosen Rufu to move ahead and win its battles. Interestingly, though, a point of disagreement at this particular stage in the book between Toynbee and Ikeda was that Toynbee said, first we would have to establish a world government, and then the world would need a religion, a new religion. This was the opposite to what President Ikeda said, which was that you will not establish world government unless you first of all bring about a change in the hearts of the people, which necessitates a powerful new religion. So the new religion has to come first, which it has, and then a world government. Due to the human revolution in many, 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 many individuals, the world government will have a chance to actually build itself and become an effective force. And also, going back to the external causes and effects, the two authors talk about the way in which the economy can be boosted, not through war, but through other alternative methods. And they mention specifically in housing, in education, and in social security, and especially in what they call massive support economically for the third world, for the less fortunate countries. Because there is this imbalance. Even that could be a cause for war, certainly minor wars, if not greater wars. The fact that half the world is deprived, and the other half of the world, which includes us in Northern Europe, are, comparatively speaking, rich. We may not all feel rich ourselves, but by and large we're rich, aren't we? Even though we're finding it difficult to meet our electric bill, we're rich in every sense compared to those who are suffering in Ethiopia or wherever else. So massive aid to such countries would be possible if the threat of war was reduced. So you can see that we're all, and our ancestors have all been slaves of war, because in the end they were slaves of the economy. And it was economic pressures which brought about wars. I don't know whether there's a glimmer of light in the fact that at last even Maggie Thatcher is beginning to think about the spiritual aspect of things rather than the material aspect of things, which all governments have concentrated on for many, many years. They've concentrated on the material side of life. Well, she's beginning to talk about the spiritual side of life. And that's a good sign. No matter what, it's a good sign, because no one has done that since probably mid-Victorian times. So probably people will say it's reactionary of her, but I think the very fact that she is talking about something spiritual is a sort of glimmer of light in the future. It'll be a great day if the House of Commons starts to debate something which is distinctly spiritual rather than distinctly material, don't you think? So having thought about that aspect of war, its causes and effects, and the karma which it creates, we can move on to the next part of the section in the book, where they talk about the problem of atomic or nuclear power, the peaceful use of nuclear power. So we all know that coal supplies, in the end, will run out. We all know that all oil supplies, in the end, will run out. And the problem is that nuclear power is created through uranium and so on, which is used in only very small quantities. Of course, it could run out in the end, but it will take much longer for the way in which to make a nuclear bomb run out as compared with oil and petrol. So it's an attractive, again, economically, it's a very attractive form of power to those who are in power in a country and who are required to somehow try to balance these economic pressures. But of course, it's an incredibly dangerous form of power. Apart from the aspect of war, there's the huge danger of the disposal of waste. There's a huge danger in actually handling it. And of course, so long as it's used for peaceful purposes, it can very easily be switched by scientists to warlike uses. So there is always a danger when that form of power is uppermost. Sensei proposes, and indeed now others are proposing strongly, some system of inspection would be essential. But for that to work, you need a strong world government, really. To have a system of inspection of the use of nuclear power for peaceful means. However, as he says, if you can't achieve it in one step, which you certainly can't, then the only thing is to grind on step by step by step until that sort of inspection system is achieved. But of course, now there are other dangers popping up. We just heard recently that Israel almost surely has a large or a growing stock of nuclear bombs. This is very worrying. Even small countries now can produce the bomb. Then one thinks immediately of people like Gaddafi and so on. So this is really frightening, isn't it? And of course, it's frightening the superpowers too. In that sense, it's good news. So there is especially now an interplay of these forces. And it's the crucial time, I feel, therefore, when if we're going to win through, the voice of the people is going to become more and more important. It's the voice of the people in the end that is going to be heard and is going to eventually establish a peaceful world. Politicians, the statesmen, are too close, too much under pressure. They can't see the wood for the trees. They don't even have time to think. The more one reads this section, the more obvious it becomes that the only power which will bring about a peaceful world is the power of the voices of people. That is as clear as day to me. So it makes it all the more clear what an incredible movement I belong to. Because in the end, that is what this movement is aiming towards, isn't it? For people, through their own inner reformation, to develop the courage and the wisdom and also the compassion to speak out in increasing numbers. And perhaps that makes it also clear why Sensei is promoting cultural exchange. Because it's through cultural exchange in all sorts of different areas, in art, live arts, visual arts, education also, and so on, that friendships and trust, in terms of our slogan in NSUK, trust through friendship. Sorry, I forgot it myself. Trust through friendship, peace through trust. Isn't it? That's the only way. The more people of various countries right across the globe get to know each other in these various ways, then the more united the people of the world will become, and the more determined they'll become to stop war and establish peace forever. It'll take years, of course, but we have the privilege of being in on it from almost the very beginning. So at that point, I'll ask Sandra to read. It's actually, those of you who've got the books, page 189.
This is Mr. Dr. Toynbee talking. Unless and until the people of the world agree to renounce the use of atomic power for war, and unless and until we have established a world authority with effective power to ensure that this renunciation is scrupulously honored in practice, it will not be safe for us to go ahead with the use of atomic power for peaceful purposes. An effective world authority for controlling the use of atomic energy presupposes the establishment of an effective world government. By this I mean a government that will be able to enforce its will throughout the world as effectively as Qin Shi Huangdi was able to enforce his will throughout China after the year 221 BC, and as effectively as Hideyoshi and Ieyasu were able to enforce their wills throughout Japan.
Hideyoshi and Ieyasu were the Tokugawas, or Ieyasu was the Tokugawa. So Toynbee is very adamant, isn't he? But this book was written now 1973. It's already 12 years or more, no, more than that, old. And I'm afraid people are going ahead in the development of nuclear power for peaceful purposes. So we have a great problem there, and something that's going to have to be solved. And perhaps, Chernobyl and the ghastly suffering that occurred through the leakage made people think, and it'll happen again. Of that, I've no doubt at all. It's not a comfortable thought that on this little railway, which is just, where is it? Here? Here? Or here? I've lost my bearings. Anyway, on that little railway, quite frequent intervals, they're running trains with nuclear waste. It's a thought, isn't it? So movements such as creating nuclear zones, nuclear-free zones, I believe are incredibly important. It may seem nothing if, say, a small town somewhere in one of the counties announces that it's a nuclear-free zone. But I think it's an incredibly important step. They may have nothing to do. Nuclear trains may not pass through their county or whatever. They may have no direct link with nuclear production at all. But it's an expression, or should be, an expression of the will of the people in that particular town. And that has an important effect maybe on the people in the next town and the next town and so on. Japan is the only nuclear-free zone on a national scale that exists in the world. But I hope that as the nuclear threat becomes more and more a problem which people see has to be solved no matter what, we'll see other nations becoming nuclear-free zones. Some way, the nuclear threat has to be tackled. Actually, it's quite interesting in my notes for this lecture, because at the last New Century session, what I was quoting was not Chernobyl, because it hadn't happened. It was Bhopal. And I said, look at what happened and the suffering from the leakage of chemicals that was from that chemical plant in India, where thousands and thousands of people suffered. That time there would be no Chernobyl. Now I can actually say, that's the way things are going. I can actually say now, 2 years later, look at Chernobyl. It's quite a thought, isn't it? So on that thought, probably is a good time to pause. It's 2:00, isn't that right, Sandra? And to have what? 20 minutes break for coffee. I think so. So, shall we go on? Good. So we were talking about the dangers of the use of nuclear power for peaceful means, the incredible dangers that still exist. And as you know, apart from Chernobyl, there are dangers in how to dispose of the waste. They say they've invented a container that, will not disintegrate until what it contains is no longer harmful. But there is no way really of knowing that. And they're dumping these things in the sea. We've no idea really whether what they say will actually last and prevent any danger. If you go up to Cumbria, you visit the members there, especially in Whitehaven, which is near to Sellafield, you'll see what the effect of having even a nuclear plant near where you live has. So, for instance, it's extremely difficult in some areas there to grow anything in your garden. The gardens sometimes are barren, where the wind blows in that direction. And the coastline of parts of Cumbria near Sellafield is a ghastly sight. I've no idea what the chemicals are that are turning the sea a different color near the coast and causing huge areas of sort of froth. I can only describe it as, to cover the beaches and so on. Really horrible. I'm happy to say we have one member working at Sellafield. That's a good thing. And it leads to the point I wanted to make, that where we talk about, where I was talking about the voice of the people being the only way to stop this, I'm not necessarily talking about mass demonstrations. I'm talking about the voice of each person on their own chosen path of life, because that, as we know, is the way, so far as the Gohonzon is concerned, Kosen Rufu is achieved. It's the voice of one person having the courage to express their views and feelings in all fields of society that is the most powerful thing of all. Far more powerful than a mass demonstration in Hyde Park, which is a one-off thing, and once it's over, it's forgotten. But the voice of the person who, almost often without realizing it, is expressing the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin about life, at work, in a doctor's surgery, maybe his receptionist, in a school, one person, in Sellafield, one person. Gradually there may be more that join them, support them, looking at everything from the aspect of the Gohonzon and of the Nichiren Daishonin's incredible philosophy of life, rather than from the common or garden way, which is seeing only the external causes and effects of things. and not the inherent cause. That is the way things will change. And that is why, again, Sensei, in launching the cultural movement, is thinking of individual relationships between people, not mass relationships. So in due course, we're hoping to have a great exhibition of Japanese treasures. Every person involved in that, in one way or another, is going to meet other people in the same sort of field, people who appreciate those sort of things, people who are working in and amongst them, making their living out of them. Doesn't matter which way, but there is common ground between people all over the world